Hello again. My name is Len Bear, MD, and my presentation at today's symposium is called Thorny Road to the Diagnosis of NKBI. So let's talk about terminology. As I was going through the diagnostic process, the government terminology for the attacks is and still remains AHI, or anomalous health incidents. However, Robert McCreight, political scientist who advises NATO on modern technologies, has a better definition, better term that we should accept. It's called neurostrike, and it's defined as radio frequency directed energy pulse that acts as a neurocognitive disruptor, which is designed to harm, disable, and permanently damage a human brain. Much better definition than AHI, which is kind of amorphous. And then everybody knows Havana syndrome as a condition, and it is a misnomer. The correct diagnostic unit is NKBI. NKBI stands for non-kinetic brain energy, which means it's different from concussion, where a mechanical object damages your brain, but in NKBI, only the energy is moving that damages your brain. So it's been exactly 5 years for me. I've been targeted since April of 2019. So I had V2K, then I started getting neurostrikes accompanied by vibrations, or the correct term for vibrations that you feel, this sensory phenomenon, is called buffeting. It progressed to the point that I had a myoclonic jerks, not a seizure because I never lost consciousness, but went to ER. I have a fully developed remote neural monitoring and intervention, which works in um, coordination with V2K and other and neurostrikes, severe vestibular dysfunction, and quite serious cognitive decline. I'm officially have a premorbid dementia. I put a timeline for you with some of the important event. So in April 19, my targeting began with V2K. In December 19, I was in ER with myoclonus. In January 20th, my diagnosis was made by Dr. Hoffer at University of Miami, who diagnosed me with ANSD, and that's the previous diagnosis before NKBI. It's called acquired neurosensory dysfunction, and there are lectures, the papers you can find that explain why Dr. Hoffer could not call it mild traumatic brain injury. First, there was no concussion because it's synonymous with concussion, and the second one, the set of symptoms and manifestations were different from MTBI. So he came up with this temporary syndrome, but it all means the findings that he found in me were congruent with the findings in the Havana cohort, which is the specific subset of Havana syndrome that is happening worldwide. Then there's a long gap, and you can ask me, you can ask what was going on. I was trying to get an investigation going through DoD, through FBI, with the help of my congresswoman and House of Representative. Nothing, absolutely nothing would happen. But then in April 22 and in October 22, 6 months apart, I did a electric neuroimaging method, which is called qEEG. It stands for quantitative electroencephalogram, and we'll talk about it later. In August of 22, Dr. Giordana, I hope you know this name. He's a world-renowned neuroweapon expert in DC at Georgetown University. In my case was confirmed, and he's forwarded for investigation to the DoD twice without any result. There was an escalation of my targeting after the lawsuit targeting Justice v. Garland was filed in January. There was a serious escalation. All plaintiffs reported the same thing. Since April 12, 23, I'm on disability with the diagnosis of NKBI, non-kinetic brain injury. And finally, there was a recent escalation that simply took me out of any social activity in less than about 2 months after I published a lecture of NKBI. So that's the synopsis of my targeting. Okay, let's talk about qEEG. The full name for this method is qEEG with SW Loretta. SW Loretta is a software package that analyzes the signals. So the difference between regular EEG that you see waves on a moving piece of paper. qEEG, quantitative, has a completely different approach. It actually creates imaging methods, and it's electric neuroimaging. It's for longest time, it has been considered a complementary method to fMRI, which produces images. It's also a neuroimaging method, but it does not produce, it produces images of the structure and certain chemical things like distribution of water in the tissue, but it doesn't reflect the electrical changes. So, for example, if somebody looks at fMRI and tells you, "Oh, there's a activity at delta speed," they're lying. You can't. fMRI is not an electric imaging. It's just a neuroimaging. This is an example of these three-dimensional images produced with qEEG. You see a normal, a bunch of nodes, occasional disruption, and then this is from my first qEEG in April 2022. You see a massive disruption. All these dark lines represent connections at delta speed. Delta speed is the slowest between 0 and 3 hertz, and you're not supposed to see this kind of activity in the awakened state, only in the deep state or hypnotic state. And I can tell you that 6 months later, I did a second qEEG. I insisted on doing it because I wanted to show progress. And since it's a quantitative method, you can show progress. And so the global number of that delta connection, of these broken connections, slow connections, was 400% higher. Let's talk about fMRI because the uh, government community, the clients of attorney Mark Zaid, they all rely on this method. It's considered to be the golden standard, and yet these are the studies that were done. fMRI studies were done in patients with NKBI or patients who experienced AHA. The first one came out in 2019 in JAMA. There were 4 participants with AHI and 48 controls. Just recently, JAMA also published a larger study that was sponsored and paid for by NIH, and it had 86 participants with AHI and the same amount of control. Just by looking at it, I can see the intent of this latest study to dilute the affected study, but we'll talk about it later. So in the first study, in the 2019 study, the significant difference between a group exposed to AHI and healthy controls was detected. In this new study, in the latest study, a significant difference between participants with AHI, but not between all AHI and controls were detected. The leading method that showed most difference is called DTI, or diffusion tensor imaging. That's the method that was showing the most difference. Diffusion fMRI measures alterations of water diffusivity in the brain. Doesn't show brain connectivity or electric disruption. It simply shows how the water moves through the tissues. And ultimately, the mechanism behind diffusivity changes are not well understood. But what is well understood is electrical connectivity using qEEG. So what I'm trying to say is that we, a non-government community of victims of neurostrike slash AHI, we found a method that would help clients of attorney's aid because they only rely on fMRI and they are not relying on the methods that we in the non-government community found. So I'm calling for more collaboration between the government employees affected by DHI and civilian victims. So we can pull together our intellectual powers. So why did this latest NIH study failed to show the difference? On this slide, I combine my thoughts with the thoughts of Dr. Relman, who wrote an editorial in the same issue of JAMA. Dr. Relman was a chair of the National Academy of Sciences consensus report and a co-chair in the intelligence community report. And the difference, the National Academy of Sciences, not everybody on the panel had a security clearance, and intelligence community report in 2022, everybody had clearance. So that report is going further. It was not published, it was obtained via FOIA, and a lot of it is redacted, but at the same time, a lot of it is very helpful and needed to be understood by the doctors. So I highly recommend going to the source. So this is a summary of why it failed. Heterogeneity of AHI cases, heterogeneity of exposure, various duration and intensity of AHI on neurostrikes, lack of clear case definition and acceptance of participants by referral. Basically, they took everybody that the Department of Justice or Department of State sent them to edit to the study. Variable delays from symptom onset and clinical assessment from 1 day to 1,495 days. That's kind of variability we're talking about. Dilution of important signals from a cluster of affected individuals. Once again, the pool of AHI affected patients doubled, and a lot of them were simply sent by referral. That diluted the signal. And what's interesting, one of the recent study state that pulse RF energy with different configuration can affect neuronal electric activity without causing discernible structural damage. Structural damage measured by fMRI. Neuronal electric activity measured by qEEG. That's a hint that we have the right method. Current fMRI technology may be insensitive to improperly timed out to the kinds of potentially transient cellular and local physiological disruption that characterizes AHI neurostrike, says Dr. Albert. And he also mentioned that new sensitive standardized methods of neuroimaging are required. And we have the answer. Non-kinetic brain injury is not going away. It's not exclusive to diplomats and spy. It's a matter of public safety and security. DOD refuses to investigate civilian cases. FBI refuses to investigate civilian cases. Congress Intelligence Committee refuses to investigate civilian cases. So it is our duty to educate our colleagues about the reality of NKBI. Here's what Dr. Relman writes in his editorial. Prejudice and poorly supported assumption must be set aside. Clear and timely public communication is essential. The delivery of appropriate non-judgmental care must be initiated without delay. The experience with AHI provides valuable lessons for clinicians, the scientific and national security communities, and national and international policymakers. We ignore them at our own collective peril. I agree with Dr. Elman wholeheartedly, except with the treatment part. I'm referring you to my Substack, which is titled Treatment for Reoccurring Ongoing NKBI is Not Medical. It's removing the weapons that produce that nerve strike. That's my presentation. On the next slide, my coordinates, where you can find me. Thank you very much, and let's have a wonderful rest of our symposium.